Ben Harper had lived a quiet life since retiring from the service. Settling in a modest house on the edge of town where the woods stretched out like an endless sea of dark green. His only companion was Buddy, a golden retriever with a heart as big as his paws. A dog that had been with him through thick and thin. Ben liked his routines: morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks through the town, occasional fishing trips when the weather was right. Life was predictable, just the way he wanted it. But lately, something strange had been happening. Something that gnawed at the edges of his peace. Buddy had been disappearing at night. It had started subtly. Ben would wake up in the morning and find the dog's bed empty, only for Buddy to come trotting in through the back door, tongue hanging out, tail wagging like nothing was amiss. At first, he figured the dog was restless, maybe chasing rabbits in the yard. But it didn't sit right with him. He always locked the doors before bed. Always. One evening, he made sure to bolt everything. Even checked the windows just in case. But the next morning, Buddy was gone again. That was when Ben knew something wasn't right. A man like Ben didn't like unsolved mysteries. His years in the service had trained him to notice details, to trust his gut. And right now, his gut told him something strange was happening. So, he did the only thing he could think of. He set up a security camera facing the back door. That night, he sat in his chair with a book, feigning relaxation. But he didn't sleep. He listened. He waited. Buddy lay by the fireplace, seeming as peaceful as ever, until sometime past midnight when the dog lifted his head, ears twitching. Then, without hesitation, Buddy got up, padded toward the back of the house, and disappeared down the hall. Ben moved carefully, making sure his steps were silent on the wooden floor. He reached the door just in time to hear the distinct click of the lock disengaging. His pulse quickened. He rounded the corner just as the door swung open, all on its own, and Buddy slipped into the night. Ben stood frozen. He had locked that door. He was sure of it. The next morning, after Buddy returned, happy as ever, Ben checked the camera footage. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. The dog approached the door, sat for a moment as if waiting for something, and then, without any visible force, the lock turned. The door opened, and Buddy walked right through. Ben rewound it, played it again. No intruder, no trick, just that door unlocking itself. That was it. He had to find out where Buddy was going. The following night, he dressed warmly, clipped a small flashlight to his belt, and waited. When Buddy stirred, Ben was ready. He followed as quietly as he could, stepping out into the cool night air, his breath visible in the moonlight. The dog moved with purpose, heading straight for the woods. Ben's boots crunched against the leaves as he trailed behind. The deeper they went, the quieter it got, the sounds of the town fading away until there was nothing but the whisper of the wind through the trees. Buddy wasn't just out for a stroll, he had a destination. After about 15 minutes, the dog stopped near a cluster of trees, his tail wagging as he approached what looked like a small, makeshift shelter made from branches and an old tarp. Ben's hand instinctively went to the flashlight. But before he could switch it on, there was movement. A figure shifted inside the shelter. Ben tensed, his military instincts kicking in. His voice came out firm but calm. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, a rustling sound. And finally, a small voice. "Please, don't call the cops." Ben exhaled, relaxing just slightly. He took a step closer. Enough for the moonlight to reveal a boy, thin, dirty, no older than 13 or 14, his face pale with fear. Buddy had already reached him, pressing his warm nose against the boy's hand in reassurance. Ben studied him for a moment. The kid wasn't just camping out here for fun. He looked tired, worn out, homeless. "What's your name?" Ben asked. The boy hesitated. "Liam." Ben nodded, glancing at the shelter. "How long you been out here?" "Liam, a while." That wasn't an answer, but Ben could tell pushing wouldn't help. The kid was scared, and right now, he had no reason to trust him. "You hungry?" Ben asked instead. Liam hesitated again before nodding. Ben sighed. "All right, I've got some food back at my place. You come with me, get a meal, warm up a little, and we'll figure things out from there." Liam's eyes darted around as if considering an escape. But Buddy nudged him again, tail wagging, and something in the boy's posture eased. "Okay," he whispered. Ben led the way back, keeping an easy pace so Liam wouldn't feel pressured. Once inside, he sat the boy at the kitchen table, set a plate in front of him, and watched as he ate like he hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. When Liam finally slowed down, Ben leaned forward. "You got family, kid?" Liam's shoulders tensed. "Not really." Ben could tell there was more to it than that. But he let it be. "Where you from?" "A couple towns over." Ben nodded slowly. He wasn't going to press. Not yet. The boy would tell him when he was ready. What mattered now was that he was safe. Buddy curled up beside Liam, as if he had already decided the boy belonged there. Ben leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. He wasn't sure what he had expected to find when he followed Buddy into the woods. But it sure as hell wasn't this. A runaway, a scared kid with nowhere to go. But here he was. And now, Ben had a decision to make. Ben Harper wasn't one to pry. He knew from experience that some wounds took time to heal, and forcing someone to talk never did much good. So, when Liam sat at his kitchen table that night, picking at the last of his food with wary eyes, Ben didn't push. The boy had agreed to come inside, to eat, to warm up, and that was enough for now. When Liam finished, Ben simply took the plate, washed it, and set a blanket on the couch before saying, "You can stay here tonight if you want. No pressure." Liam didn't answer right away. His fingers curled against the fabric of his thin, worn-out sweatshirt. His small frame hunched as if expecting something to go wrong. "I think I'll go back," he muttered after a long silence. Ben nodded. "Suit yourself." Buddy whined at Liam's feet, nudging him gently, but the boy stood, hesitant but determined. Ben didn't try to stop him. Instead, he grabbed a brown paper bag from the counter, packed some sandwiches, an apple, and a bottle of water, and handed it to Liam. "Take this with you." Liam hesitated, then took it. "Thanks." Ben watched as the boy disappeared into the night. Buddy sitting at the doorway, Ears perked, tail still. The old man sighed. He had a feeling this wasn't the last he'd see of Liam. And he was right. The next night, Buddy started pacing by the back door again. Just past midnight, when Ben opened it, the dog bolted into the darkness. This time, Ben followed but kept his distance. Sure enough, when he reached the familiar clearing in the woods, Liam was there, sitting near his makeshift shelter, knees pulled to his chest. He looked up as Buddy bounded toward him, licking his face like an old friend. Ben didn't approach, didn't speak right away. He simply set down another paper bag of food a few feet away and crouched, making himself small, non-threatening. "Figured you might be hungry," he said. Liam didn't grab it immediately. He stared at Ben as if weighing his options before finally reaching for the bag. He didn't say thank you this time. But Ben didn't expect him to. He just sat back on his heels and watched as the boy unwrapped a peanut butter sandwich, taking small, careful bites like he was afraid it might disappear. "You been out here long?" Ben asked casually. Liam shrugged. "A while." Ben nodded. He had figured as much. The kid was too thin. His clothes too ragged. He had the look of someone used to surviving. Someone who didn't trust easily. Ben knew that look well. "You got anywhere else to go?" he asked after a moment. Liam's jaw tensed, and he shook his head. "No." Ben exhaled through his nose, looking up at the sky. The stars clear and bright against the darkness. "It's getting colder," he said. "Winter's coming." Liam didn't answer, but Ben saw the slight shiver that ran through him. "You need anything else?" "Blanket. Flashlight," Ben offered. Liam hesitated, then nodded. "All right, I'll bring some by tomorrow," Ben said, standing. "You stay safe, kid." That night, as Ben walked back home, Buddy trotting beside him, he knew he had to tread carefully. Liam wasn't just a runaway. He was a scared kid with nowhere to go. And that wasn't something Ben could ignore. Over the next few nights, the routine became familiar. Buddy would disappear into the woods, and Ben would follow at a distance, always bringing food, always leaving supplies, extra socks, a heavier jacket, a small first aid kit. At first, Liam barely spoke, only nodding in thanks or giving one-word answers. But as the nights passed, he began to talk more, little by little. One night, as they sat near the dying embers of a small fire Liam had made, Ben finally learned the truth. "I ran away," Liam admitted quietly, picking at the hem of his sleeve. "From foster care." Ben kept his expression neutral. "Bad place?" Liam's jaw clenched, and he nodded. "The guy was—" he hesitated, then looked away. "Not a good person." Ben didn't need the details to understand. His hands curled into fists at his sides. But he kept his voice calm. "You report it to anyone?" Liam scoffed. "Didn't matter. They don't listen." Ben exhaled slowly. He had seen enough in his years to know that not all foster homes were safe. And kids like Liam too often slipped through the cracks. "You ever think about trying again? Another home?" Ben asked. Liam shook his head fiercely. "No, I'm not going back." Ben didn't argue. Instead, he tossed another log onto the fire. watching as the flames sparked to life again. "I get it," he said finally. "Some places ain't safe." Liam's eyes flickered toward him. Cautious but curious. "You ever been in a place like that?" Ben sighed, scratching at his graying beard. "Not quite the same. But yeah, Army had some rough patches. Some bad people in charge." Liam nodded as if he understood. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Buddy lay beside Liam, head resting on his lap. A silent source of comfort. "You don't have to go back," Ben said eventually, "but you can't stay out here forever. It's only gonna get colder." Liam didn't answer, but he didn't argue either. The next night, when Ben arrived with dinner, Liam was waiting, not just for Buddy this time, but for him. It was a start. The air had turned sharp with the bite of late autumn, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made the nights feel longer. Ben had always preferred the chill over the sweltering heat of summer. But he knew the dropping temperatures meant trouble for Liam. The boy had been holding his own out in the woods. But there was only so much a kid could do against the cold. "Just one night," Ben said as they stood on the porch. Liam shifted on his feet, glancing toward the woods like he was considering running back. His arms were wrapped tightly around himself. And despite the heavier jacket Ben had given him, he still looked small, fragile against the creeping frost. "You don't have to stay," Ben continued, keeping his voice easy, casual, "but I'd feel better knowing you weren't freezing out there. You can sleep in the guest room. No strings attached." Liam hesitated, his fingers tightening around the strap of the backpack he always carried. Then, Buddy nudged his leg, looking up at him with warm, trusting eyes, his tail wagging slightly. Something in Liam's face shifted, and after a long moment, he exhaled and gave a small nod. "Just one night." Ben opened the door and stepped back, letting Liam make the choice to enter on his own. The boy walked in slowly, cautious as ever, his eyes darting around as if expecting some kind of trap. But the warmth of the house, the scent of something cooking on the stove, and the soft thud of Buddy's tail against the floor seemed to settle him. Ben led him to the small guest room, nothing fancy. Just a bed with a thick quilt, a nightstand with an old lamp, and a dresser that had been gathering dust for years. "It's yours for the night," Ben said. "Bathrooms down the hall. If you need anything, just ask." Liam nodded but didn't say much. He stood stiffly in the doorway for a long moment before finally stepping inside, setting his backpack down by the bed like he didn't quite trust he was allowed to put it anywhere else. Ben didn't hover. He knew when to give someone space. So, he left the boy to settle and went back to the kitchen, checking on the stew he had simmering. Not long after, he heard hesitant footsteps in the hallway. Liam appeared, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, looking uncertain. "Figured you might be hungry," Ben said, motioning to the table. "Made enough for two." Liam hesitated but sat down. He still ate like someone who wasn't sure when his next meal would come, quick, careful, like it might disappear. Ben didn't say anything about it. He just passed him a piece of bread and kept the conversation light. Talking about Buddy, about the weather, about a fishing trip he took years ago. Liam didn't add much, but he listened, and that was enough. That one night turned into another. Then another. Liam still kept his guard up. Still flinched at loud noises and avoided answering questions about his past. But little by little, he started to settle. He helped wash dishes after meals without being asked. He let Buddy curl up beside him on the couch when they watched old westerns on the TV. He started to leave his backpack in his room instead of carrying it around everywhere. A small but significant sign that he was beginning to trust that this place was safe. And then one night, as they sat by the fire, Buddy sprawled across Liam's lap. The boy spoke without being prompted. "I used to have a dog," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost beneath the crackling of the fire. Ben set his coffee mug down and looked over. "Yeah?" Liam nodded, his fingers running absently through Buddy's fur. "Her name was Rosie. She was a mutt, had these big ears that never stayed down. She'd follow me everywhere." Ben could hear the fondness in his voice. But there was sadness too. "What happened to her?" he asked gently. Liam's expression darkened. "When I ran away, I couldn't take her with me. She was still at the foster house." He swallowed hard. "I don't know what happened to her." Ben felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He had lost a lot in his life, friends, family, things he couldn't get back. But he knew how deep that kind of loss could cut. Especially for a kid like Liam, who had already lost so much. "She was a good dog," Liam murmured. "She always knew when I was upset. She'd sit with me, just like Buddy does." Ben nodded, watching the boy's face, the way his fingers curled around Buddy's fur like he was holding onto something precious. That night, after Liam had gone to bed, Ben sat in his chair, staring into the fire, thinking. He had never been one to meddle in other people's affairs. But this felt different. He pulled out his laptop, opened a browser, and started searching. It took some digging, but by the next afternoon, he had a lead. Rosie had been taken to a local shelter a few months back. But she hadn't been adopted yet. Ben's grip tightened on the phone as he spoke to the shelter staff. "She's still there?" "Yeah," the woman on the other end said. "Sweet dog. Been waiting a while for a home." Ben glanced toward the living room, where Liam was sitting on the floor, tossing a tennis ball for Buddy. "I think I've got one for her." The next morning, he didn't say anything to Liam about where they were going. "Got an errand to run," was all he said as they climbed into the truck. Liam didn't ask questions, but he watched the roads closely, like he was trying to figure out where they were headed. When they pulled up to the shelter, Liam frowned. "What is this?" Ben put the truck in park and looked over at him. "Come inside and see." Liam's confusion deepened, but he followed Ben through the doors. The shelter was small but clean, the sound of barking filling the air. A woman behind the counter smiled. "You must be Mr. Harper." Ben nodded. "We're here to see Rosie." Liam froze beside him, his breath hitched. "Wait, Rosie?" The woman nodded. "Right this way." They walked down a row of kennels. And then, suddenly, a high-pitched, excited bark rang out. "Rosie!" The moment Liam saw her, his face crumpled. "Rosie!" he gasped. dropping to his knees as the dog practically exploded with joy, jumping at the kennel door, her tail wagging so hard her whole body shook. Ben stepped back, giving them space as the shelter worker opened the door. Rosie launched herself at Liam, licking his face, whining, pressing against him like she couldn't believe he was real. Liam buried his face in her fur, his shoulders shaking. I thought I lost you," he whispered. Ben swallowed the lump in his throat and let out a breath. "Guess she was waiting for you." Liam looked up at him, eyes wide and shining. Can she come home with us?" Ben smiled. "Yeah, kid, she's yours." For the first time since they met, Liam didn't look scared. He didn't look like a runaway. He looked like a boy who had finally found his way home. Ben had seen a lot in his life: war, loss, hardship, but few things got to him the way that look in Liam's eyes did when he talked about Rosie. There was something raw in the boy's voice. Something that spoke of a love too deep to be erased by time or distance. Ben knew what it meant to lose something that kept you steady. That one thing in the world that made you feel like you belonged. And he knew, without a doubt, that if he had any say in it, Liam wasn't going to lose Rosie forever. So he started making calls. Local shelters, rescue groups, even a few veterinarians in the area. It took time, a lot of explaining, and more than a few dead ends. But Ben wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. And then, finally, he got a lead. "She was here," the woman at the shelter said over the phone. "Rosie came in a few months back. Sweet dog. She got adopted pretty quickly." Ben's grip on the phone tightened. "Do you have any information on the family that took her?" There was a pause. "Legally, I can't give out the details. But if you tell me why you're looking for her, I could contact them for you." Ben glanced over at Liam, who was sitting at the kitchen table, running his fingers through Buddy's fur. Lost in thought. She belonged to a boy who never wanted to give her up. He ran from a bad situation. And when he left, he had to leave her behind. He's with me now, and if there's any way she can come back to him, I'd like to try. The woman was silent for a moment. And when she spoke again, there was something softer in her tone. "I'll make the call." Ben didn't tell Liam just yet. He didn't want to get his hopes up. Not until he knew for sure. But later that evening, when the phone rang and the shelter called back, he had an answer. "They want to talk to you," the woman said. "I explained the situation, and they were surprised. Apparently, Rosie hasn't been settling in. She's been restless. They were wondering if maybe she was missing something. Turns out she was." Ben wasted no time. He got in touch with the family, a couple living just outside of town. They had taken Rosie in, thinking they were giving her a good home. But she hadn't been the same since they adopted her. She would pace by the door at night, whine at the window, and refuse to settle. "She's a wonderful dog," the woman on the phone admitted. "But I think she's been waiting for something, or someone." Ben looked over at Liam, who was watching him with quiet curiosity. He nodded. "Would you be willing to let the boy see her?" There was a pause, then a sigh. "Come by tomorrow. Let's see what happens." That night, Ben sat across from Liam at the table, folding his hands over his coffee mug. "Kid, I think I found Rosie." Liam's breath hitched. His fingers curled against his sleeves. You did?" Ben nodded. "She got adopted a few months ago. Family's been good to her. But she hasn't been happy. They said she's been acting like she's waiting for someone." Liam swallowed hard. "Me?" Ben nodded. "We're going to see her tomorrow." Liam didn't speak right away. He just sat there, gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Then, slowly, his lips parted, and he whispered, "She remembers me." It wasn't a question. It was a realization. The next morning, they drove out to the small house on the edge of town. A cozy place with a white picket fence and a wide yard. As soon as they pulled up, a dog's sharp bark rang through the air. Liam stiffened in the passenger seat, his hands gripping his knees. Ben reached over and gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Go on," he said gently. Liam didn't need to be told twice. He pushed open the truck door and barely took 2 steps before the front door swung open. And then Rosie was there. She bolted across the yard, ears flapping, her body all frantic, joyful movement. She let out a sharp, high-pitched whine, and then she launched herself at Liam, knocking him back onto the ground. Liam let out a choked laugh, his arms wrapping tightly around her. "Rosie," his voice broke, and Rosie licked at his face, whining, pawing at him like she couldn't believe he was real. She hadn't forgotten. She had never forgotten. Ben stood back, watching as Liam buried his face in Rosie's fur, his shoulders shaking. The couple who had adopted her stood on the porch, watching with something between sadness and understanding in their expressions. "She was never really ours. Was she?" the woman murmured to her husband. The man shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Nope." They gave Liam a few minutes before stepping forward. The woman knelt beside him, reaching out to scratch Rosie behind the ears. "She's a wonderful dog," she said softly. "We love her, but I think she was waiting for you all along." Liam looked up, eyes wide and uncertain. "Does this mean?" The woman smiled, a little teary-eyed. "She's yours." Liam clung to Rosie, pressing his face into her fur, his whole body shaking with relief. "Thank you," he whispered. The couple didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. They saw what Ben had seen, that Rosie and Liam belonged together. On the drive home, Rosie sat in the back seat with her head resting on Liam's lap, sighing contentedly. Liam didn't stop touching her, running his fingers through her fur, whispering quiet words only she could hear. Ben glanced over at him. "You all right, kid?" Liam looked up, his eyes still red but shining in a way Ben had never seen before. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I think I am." Ben nodded, focusing back on the road. For the first time since he'd found Liam in the woods, he saw something different in the boy. Not just relief, not just gratitude, hope, and maybe, just maybe, a sense of home. The days that followed Rosie's return felt different. The house felt fuller, warmer. Liam still moved carefully, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. But there was a new ease in the way he carried himself. He no longer clung to his backpack like a lifeline, no longer slept with one foot ready to bolt out the door. He didn't talk much about it, but Ben could see the change in the way he let himself sink into the couch when they watched old westerns. The way he left the dinner table a little later each night, lingering in conversation. And then there was Rosie. She and Buddy became inseparable almost immediately, racing around the backyard, playfully wrestling on the floor, curling up together at night like they had always belonged under the same roof. But Rosie never strayed far from Liam. If he moved, she moved. If he sat, she sat with him, pressing against his leg, as if afraid he might disappear again. Ben understood that feeling. One afternoon, as Ben worked in the garage, Liam wandered in, hands in his pockets. "Need help with anything?" he asked, his voice casual, but Ben could hear the uncertainty underneath. Ben looked up from the tool bench and nodded toward a set of shelves. "Sure. Been meaning to clear out some of this old junk. You can help me sort through it." Liam nodded, stepping forward. It wasn't much, just sorting through old fishing gear, dusty boxes of forgotten odds and ends, but they worked in comfortable silence. Side by side, every so often, Ben would explain the purpose of a tool or tell a short story about some long-ago project. And Liam would listen, occasionally asking questions. By the time they were done, Liam looked pleased with himself, brushing dust off his hands. Ben watched as he surveyed the now organized shelves. And then, out of nowhere, Liam said, "I was thinking about school." Ben didn't react right away. He kept his voice even when he asked, "Yeah, what about it?" Liam shifted. "Maybe I could try going back. Not right away, but soon." Ben nodded. "That's a good idea. You're a smart kid. Be a shame not to use that." Liam let out a small, uncertain laugh, like he wasn't sure if Ben was serious. "I guess. You thinking regular school or GED?" Ben asked. Liam hesitated, considering. "I don't know. Regular school, maybe." He glanced over. "You think I could do it?" Ben met his eyes, steady and sure. "Yeah, I do." Liam nodded slowly, as if letting the thought settle. "I was also thinking, maybe I could get a job. Just part-time." Ben didn't say anything for a moment. Just let the words hang between them. He could tell Liam was feeling out the edges of this new life. Testing it, seeing if it was real. "What kind of job?" Ben asked finally. Liam shrugged. "Something small. Maybe at the grocery store or a diner. Just to save up some money." Ben leaned against the workbench, studying the boy in front of him. When they first met, Liam had been all sharp edges, running on survival instincts, never thinking further than the next day. But now, he was planning, dreaming, wanting something more. Ben nodded. "I think that's a fine idea." Liam looked down, nodding to himself like he was still getting used to the idea of making choices that weren't about running or surviving. That evening, they ate dinner on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft oranges and purples. Rosie and Buddy lay at their feet, sprawled out, completely at peace. Ben sipped his coffee, stretching his legs, and sighed in contentment. Liam broke the silence, his voice quiet. "I never thought I'd have this." Ben glanced over at him. The boy wasn't looking at him, just staring at the sky. his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just quiet wonder, like he was still trying to believe it. Ben didn't say anything right away. He let the moment settle. Let the weight of those words fill the space between them. Then, simply, he said, "And now you do." Liam turned to look at him then, searching his face, like he needed to be sure Ben meant it. Ben held his gaze, steady and certain. Liam didn't say anything more. But he didn't have to. Because for the first time, he wasn't planning an escape. He wasn't bracing for the moment when everything would fall apart. For the first time, Liam wasn't running. He was home.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.